Sarah Mitchell knew she would die if she couldn't run faster. The Wyoming Territory, 1876. Her lungs burned with each desperate breath as the sound behind her grew louder. Angry snorting, the scrape of hooves against dry earth, and the terrifying squeal of wild hogs in pursuit. The stench of the animals filled her nostrils, an earthy, musky odor that meant death was gaining on her. Just last month, these same beasts had torn apart Jack Wilson from the neighboring homestead, leaving nothing but bloody rags for his family to bury. Now they were after her. "Dear God," she gasped, clutching her skirts higher as she sprinted across the open prairie. The massive lead boar gained ground, its yellow tusks capable of gutting her with a single thrust. The family homestead was still a mile away. Too far. The first gunshot cracked through the air like thunder, causing her to stumble. The second shot followed immediately, and a pained squeal erupted behind her. Blood and dirt sprayed across her skirts. Sarah didn't dare look back, even as the rhythmic pounding of horse hooves, different from the hogs, approached rapidly from her right. "Take my hand now," a deep voice commanded. Sarah turned to see a man on horseback galloping alongside her, arm extended. His face was shadowed beneath a worn Confederate cavalry hat, but she caught a glimpse of intense gray eyes locked on hers. Without hesitation, she reached for him. With remarkable strength, he pulled her up and onto his horse in one fluid motion. Sarah found herself seated sideways in front of him, his arms secure around her waist as he wheeled the chestnut stallion around and spurred it to a gallop away from the pursuing hogs. "Hold tight," he instructed, his voice close to her ear. Sarah clutched at his shirt, feeling the rapid thud of his heart beneath her fingers. As they thundered across the open plain, she caught her first proper look at her rescuer. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with several days' worth of stubble darkening a jawline marked by a thin scar that disappeared beneath his collar. Deep lines around his eyes spoke of years squinting against harsh sun and harder experiences. His right hand, the one not holding her, occasionally flexed as if working through old pain. "Thank you," Sarah managed, her voice still unsteady. "Don't mention it," he replied, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. "Those hogs would have had you. Name's Ethan Harrington." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied. "How did you know to find me?" "Wasn't looking for you specifically," Ethan said. "Been tracking that sounder for 2 days now. 7 of them, led by that big boar with the broken tusk. They've killed livestock across 3 counties. Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of how improper their position was. Her body pressed against a stranger's, his arm holding her firmly. Yet given the circumstances, propriety seemed a trivial concern. "Where were you headed?" Ethan asked, slowing his horse to a trot once he was certain they'd outrun the danger. "Our homestead," she said, pointing toward the distant bluffs. "About 3 miles that way. I was gathering red root for my mother. She's dying." The last word came out barely above a whisper. Ethan's expression softened slightly. "Consumption?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, surprised by his perception. "How did you know?" "Seen it before. Too often." Something flickered in his eyes, an old grief quickly masked. Red root helps ease the bleeding, if prepared right. As they rode, Sarah noticed a certain stiffness in his posture that didn't come from the saddle. The way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right. The occasional flex of his right hand when it wasn't occupied with the reins. "Gettysburg?" she asked, nodding toward his shoulder. Ethan's eyes snapped to hers, surprise evident before his expression hardened. "Yes," he replied tersely. "Confederate cavalry under Stuart until a Union cannonball took out half my unit, my brother included." The words hung in the air between them. 11 years had passed since Appomattox, but for many the wounds ran deeper than time could easily heal. "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "My father fought too. Mississippi infantry. Lost his brother at Shiloh." Ethan nodded, his face softening slightly at the shared understanding. The war found ways to take from everyone. As they crested a small rise, Sarah could make out the outline of her family's modest cabin and barn nestled against the bluffs. She pointed. "That's home." As they approached, a tall man emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. James Mitchell was a formidable figure at 58, his frame still powerful despite the pronounced limp he'd carried since Chapultepec in the Mexican War, long before his service to the Confederacy. A brutal scar ran from his left temple to jaw, a permanent reminder of Shiloh. His expression was guarded as he watched the horse approach with two riders. "Pa," Sarah called, "this is Mr. Harrington. He saved me from wild hogs while I was gathering medicine for Mama." James Mitchell lowered his rifle slightly but kept it ready. Years on the frontier had taught him caution. "That's so?" he asked, his weathered face revealing little as his eyes assessed the stranger. Ethan met the older man's gaze steadily. "Your daughter showed considerable courage, sir. Those hogs would have overwhelmed most men, let alone a woman alone." Something shifted in James's expression at the respect in Ethan's voice. He extended his hand. "James Mitchell, appreciate you bringing my girl home safe." Ethan's handshake was firm. "Ethan Harrington, I work for the Broken Spoke, tracking those hogs that have been causing trouble." Before James could respond, the cabin door opened, and a frail woman appeared, supported by a young man in his 20s. "Sarah?" Her voice was thin, but carried the authority of a mother's concern. "I'm fine, Mama," Sarah assured her, hurrying to help her mother back inside. "Mr. Harrington saved me from wild hogs." Eleanor Mitchell was clearly ill, her once robust frame now diminished, her skin pale despite the golden Wyoming sun. But her eyes remained sharp as they took in the stranger standing with her husband. "You must stay for supper, Mr. Harrington," she insisted, her southern accent still evident despite years in the West. "It's the least we can offer after what you did." That night, as the family gathered around the table, Ethan learned more about the Mitchells. William, the elder son at 30, serious and cautious. Thomas, the younger at 24, more open and curious. The conversation flowed more easily than Ethan had expected, until James mentioned their neighbor. "Bighorn Ranch has been diverting more water from the creek that borders our properties," James explained, his expression hardening. "Frederick Wolcott claims he has rights to the entire flow." "Wolcott," Ethan repeated, his knuckles whitening around his fork. "Colonel Frederick Wolcott, 6th Pennsylvania?" James nodded grimly. "You know him?" "We've met," Ethan said, his voice suddenly cold. "At Brandy Station. His men killed my brother." A tense silence fell over the table. Sarah watched Ethan, seeing the muscle working in his jaw, the distant look in his eyes as he revisited some private horror. "He's been trying to force us out since he arrived," James continued after a moment. "Wants to create one massive ranch. He's already bought out 3 smaller places." "When Pa refused to sell," William added, "the water problem started." "We've managed so far," James said firmly, "but with Eleanor's illness and the dry season coming—" He didn't finish the thought, but the implication was clear. The Mitchell homestead was vulnerable. Later that night, as Sarah showed Ethan to the barn where he would sleep, she asked the question that had been troubling her since dinner. "What really happened with Wolcott? It seemed personal." Ethan stopped, looking up at the stars for a long moment before answering. "Brandy Station was the largest cavalry battle of the war. In the chaos, my brother Michael and I got separated from our unit. We ran into Wolcott's men near a creek." He paused, his voice tightening. "Michael surrendered, had his hands up. Wolcott ordered his men to shoot anyway." "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "I took a bullet in the shoulder, fell into the creek. The current carried me downstream. They must have thought I drowned." His eyes met hers in the darkness. "I didn't." The next morning, Ethan joined James and his sons to hunt the wild hogs. As they rode out, Ethan shared his cavalry experience, explaining tracking techniques and ambush strategies. They positioned themselves near a watering hole and waited patiently until the hogs appeared. When the lead boar finally emerged, 4 rifles cracked nearly simultaneously. The beast dropped instantly, James's shot finding its mark. The other hogs scattered, but not before the men had brought down 2 more. A fourth hog, a large male, suddenly changed direction and charged toward William's position. Ethan's rifle came up smoothly, and he fired without hesitation. The hog collapsed mere feet from the young man. "That's twice our family owes you," William acknowledged, his usually stoic expression showing genuine gratitude. The men were field dressing their kills when the sound of approaching riders drew their attention. 5 men on horseback appeared over the rise, led by a tall figure in a black coat. Frederick Wolcott was in his early 60s, his bearing still military despite civilian clothes. Gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard framed sharp features. His eyes widened slightly as they fell on Ethan. "Harrington," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "I thought you were dead." "Disappointed?" Ethan asked, his hand drifting toward his revolver. James stepped between them. "The war's long over, gentlemen." Wolcott's expression hardened. "Indeed it is. Yet here we are, still fighting over territory." His gaze shifted to James. "My offer to buy your land stands, Mitchell. You should reconsider, especially with your wife's condition." "My answer hasn't changed," James replied coldly. "That land has been worked by my family for 8 years now. It's not for sale." "Everything has a price," Wolcott replied, "and water becomes more precious by the day." The threat was thinly veiled. After Wolcott and his men departed, Ethan helped the Mitchells secure their kills. As they worked, Thomas explained how Wolcott had been building dams upstream, gradually choking off their water supply despite a territorial court ruling in the Mitchells' favor. That evening after supper, Thomas approached Ethan on the porch. "Pa's too proud to ask," he said quietly, "but we could use another experienced hand, especially with Mama sick and harvest coming." Ethan considered the request. "I'm contracted to the Broken Spoke," he said after a moment, "though I suppose McAllister might spare me for a few weeks, given the circumstances." "And Wolcott," Thomas asked, "would staying here be difficult for you?" Ethan's gaze drifted toward the distant mountains. "Some ghosts never rest easy," he said finally, "but a man can't outrun his past forever." The next morning, Ethan rode with Sarah and William to find more red root in the foothills. As they harvested the medicinal herb, dark clouds gathered unexpectedly over the mountains. "We should head back," William warned as thunder rumbled in the distance. "Those clouds look mean." They mounted quickly, but the storm moved faster than anticipated. Within an hour, heavy rain lashed at them, turning the prairie into a muddy morass. Lightning split the darkened sky directly overhead, causing William's horse to rear in panic. "There's a line shack about 2 miles east," William shouted over the deluge. "Used it during roundups. We can shelter there." That night, as the storm raged outside the small shelter, Ethan took his turn at watch. The howling wind carried him back to cold Virginia nights during the war, to whispered conversations with Michael as they huddled under shared blankets, planning the farm they would build together after the fighting ended. "You still miss him," Sarah said softly, startling him from his memories. She had awakened and now sat beside him near the small fire. "Every day," Ethan admitted. "We had plans, Michael and I, a place of our own in the Shenandoah." He stared into the flames. "I found myself heading west after the war. Couldn't bear to go home without him." "And your wife?" Sarah asked gently. "William mentioned you had been married." "Anna," Ethan said, the name coming out like a prayer. "We married just after the war. Had 2 good years before the typhoid took her. She was carrying our first child." Sarah placed her hand gently on his arm. "I'm sorry." Ethan looked at her hand, then at her face illuminated by the firelight. "For a long time I thought that was it for me. that I'd used up whatever happiness life had allotted me. His voice grew softer. I'm not so sure anymore. At dawn, the storm had passed, but the landscape was transformed. Streams had become torrents, and normally dry gullies now flowed with muddy water. As they crested the final rise overlooking the Mitchell homestead, they saw the creek had flooded massively, its banks now a quarter-mile wide. The water had reached the edge of the cabin. James and Thomas were frantically working to divert it with makeshift barriers. But most alarming was the scene unfolding downstream. A group of riders, Wolcott's men, were attempting to reach something in the raging water. As they drew closer, they could make out a young man clinging to a partially submerged tree, the current threatening to tear him away at any moment. "That's Wolcott's son," William said in disbelief. "Matthew must have been checking the dams when they broke." Without hesitation, Ethan spurred his horse down the slope. The memory of Michael, arms raised in surrender before Wolcott's men, flashed through his mind. For a moment, the urge to ride past, to let nature exact the vengeance he'd contemplated for years, was overwhelming. Then he saw the young man's face, barely 20, terrified, innocent of his father's sins. Ethan made his decision. "Stand clear," he shouted to Wolcott's men as he reached them. Years of cavalry experience guiding him, he quickly assessed the situation, demanded rope, and prepared for the rescue. "The current's too strong," one of Wolcott's men warned. "You've been trying wrong," Ethan replied simply. He tied one end of the rope around his waist, handing the other end to William and Sarah. "When I have him, pull us in. Work with the current. Don't fight it." The water was brutally cold and powerful, but Ethan had crossed swollen rivers during the war, sometimes with enemy fire overhead. He reached Matthew Wolcott, secured him, and signaled for the others to pull. Minutes later, they collapsed on the muddy bank, both exhausted but alive. Frederick Wolcott arrived during the rescue and now dismounted hurriedly, rushing to his son. "Matthew," he said, genuine fear in his voice as he knelt beside the young man. "I'm all right, Father," Matthew managed weakly. "Mr. Harrington saved me." Wolcott looked up at Ethan, confusion and disbelief warring in his expression. "Why?" he asked simply. "After Brandy Station, why would you save my son?" Ethan met his gaze steadily. "Because he's not you," he said quietly, "and I'm not the man I was 11 years ago." For a moment, the two former enemies stared at each other, decades of hatred and war between them. Then Wolcott slowly extended his hand. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." Ethan hesitated, then accepted the handshake. As their hands clasped, something shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of a shared humanity that transcended old hatreds. "Your dams broke, Wolcott," James said, approaching them, "just as we warned they might." Wolcott nodded, his arms still around his son's shoulders. "Yes, they did." He looked from Matthew to Ethan, then to James. "Perhaps it's time we discussed a more equitable arrangement regarding the creek." That night, Ethan woke gasping from a nightmare of Brandy Station. Only this time, it was Matthew Wolcott raising his hands in surrender before being shot down. He sat up, his heart pounding, and stepped outside the barn into the cool night air. To his surprise, Sarah was already there, wrapped in a shawl, gazing at the stars. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Old dreams," Ethan replied. "They find me sometimes." They stood in comfortable silence for a while before Sarah spoke again. "What will you do now? Return to the broken spoke?" Ethan looked toward the horizon, where the first hint of dawn was appearing. "I've been thinking about that," he said slowly. "The parcel that borders your father's land to the east, Jenkins is looking to sell. It's good land, with access to the creek under the new water agreement Wolcott's proposing." Sarah's eyes widened slightly as she understood his meaning. You're considering buying it? Ethan nodded. I've saved most of what I've earned these past 5 years. It wouldn't be much to start with, a small herd, some crops, but it could grow. He paused, meeting her gaze directly. And it would mean being close to your family, to you. Why me? Sarah asked softly. You barely know me. I know enough, Ethan replied. I know you're brave enough to face down wild hogs for your mother's medicine. I know you understand loss but haven't let it break you. I know you see past the scars men carry from war. He took a deep breath. And I know that for the first time since Anna died, I'm thinking about tomorrow instead of yesterday. The following spring, Eleanor Mitchell slipped away peacefully in her sleep, her hand in Sarah's, her husband and sons nearby. They buried her beneath the cottonwood tree where she had loved to sit in better days. 2 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell became Sarah Harrington in a simple ceremony attended by both families, including Frederick and Matthew Wolcott, whose presence would have been unthinkable a year earlier. As autumn painted the prairie in golden amber, Ethan stood on the porch of his newly built cabin, watching as Sarah tended their garden. James Mitchell, standing beside his son-in-law, surveyed the thriving homestead with quiet satisfaction. Not bad for a year's work, he observed. Had good help, Ethan replied, nodding toward where William and Thomas were mending fences along the shared property line. You know, James said reflectively, when Sarah first brought you home, I wasn't sure what to make of you. Former Confederate officer turned ranch hand. He chuckled softly. But I've learned that out here, it's not where a man's been that matters. It's where he's going and who he chooses to be. Ethan nodded, understanding the wisdom in the older man's words. Some wars never really end inside a man, he admitted, but new battles give old soldiers better purpose. Sarah looked up from her garden and waved, her free hand resting briefly on her abdomen, a gesture that hadn't escaped Ethan's notice in recent weeks. I think, James said, following Ethan's gaze, that my Eleanor would be pleased with how things have turned out. He clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder. The wheel keeps turning. Life continues, even when we lose those we love. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in crimson and gold, Sarah finally took Ethan's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. I've been waiting for the right moment, she said softly. After losing Mama, it seemed almost wrong to speak of new life too soon. Ethan covered her hand with his, feeling the promise beneath his fingers. Michael always said children were God's way of telling us the world goes on. His voice caught slightly. I wish he could have met you, met our child. He will, through you, Sarah said, through the stories you'll tell, through the farm you're building, the one you planned together. Ethan pulled his wife closer, marveling at how a moment of danger, wild hogs on the prairie, had led him to this place of unexpected peace. The nightmares of Brandy Station came less frequently now. The ache of old wounds had eased. My father had a saying, he told Sarah, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. Dust on the prairie blinds a man to the path he's on. Only looking back can he see where he was meant to go all along. As darkness settled over the Wyoming territory, bringing out stars by the thousands in the vast frontier sky, Ethan Harrington held his wife close, feeling their child growing between them. Proof that even in the harshest landscapes, life finds a way to renew itself. 11 years after the war had taken his brother, 7 years after disease had taken his wife, wild hogs and broken dams had somehow led him home. The old cavalry pistol that had once represented vengeance now hung above their mantle, a reminder not of what he'd lost, but of what he'd found instead, a future worth building, one day at a time. Hey friends, thanks for listening to today's story. If you enjoyed Dust on the Prairie, hit that subscribe button and share with a friend who appreciates tales of redemption and second chances. Have you ever had a moment where danger unexpectedly led to something good in your life? Share your story in the comments below. Until next time, this is Frontier Tales, bringing you the best of the American West.